Hey everyone. Today we're going to move to the 19th century. So we've completed our discussions about the colonial period. Now we're going to start talking about immigration in the 19th century. And to set the stage for that, I want to present you with some of the push and pull factors, some of the things that are happening throughout the globe that contribute to people moving during this period. So today what I want to talk to you about is sort of the turbulent times of the 1800s and some big things demographically, politically, and socially that are happening to push people to the United States, and some things that are happening in the United States that sort of pull them in too. So the place I want to start is with population. In the 19th century, we see a dramatic increase in the population of a lot of parts of the world, particularly in Europe. This graph here shows you the population in Western and Eastern Europe. And what you can see, right, is that there's a population increase that begins right around 1700. And then a real dramatic rise in the 19th century, in the 1800s, and continuing through into the 20th century. Now you might wonder why. What's the reason for this population boom? Well, there are a few, but the first one is because of the climate. If you can remember from one of the previous lectures, one of the things I talked to you about was the Little Ice Age, or the sort of global cooling period that happened in the 17th century. This is what this chart is showing you right now, right? It's the one that I showed you from before. And as you see in this chart, when this global ice age really starts to end and global temperatures start to recover, is right around 1700. So if you map these two charts that I've just showed you on top of each other, what you see is that as the temperatures start to rise, we start to get population increases again. And this makes sense because of what we talked about last time, right? When temperatures get a little warmer or closer to that climactic optimum, then food grows for longer periods of time, it grows in more places, and so the food supply is much, much larger, which means that people are more well-nourished and thus survive. In addition to just climactic changes, in Europe in particular, there are some important technological and medicinal changes that happen in this period too. One of the main ones is the invention of the smallpox vaccine. This actually occurs in Asia much, much earlier, but it makes it to Europe in the 18th century and really starts to get widespread in the 19th century. The smallpox vaccine was incredibly important because smallpox killed a large chunk of the European population in the centuries prior to this. When the vaccine came around, right, many more people started to survive that disease, and it killed so many fewer people in the 19th century. The second major development was what historians call the Second Agricultural Revolution. This is essentially a kind of change or transformation in agricultural practices around this time. And it involves a lot of things that I won't get into, but basically it involves different types of crop rotations, different types of crops that are used to put nitrogen back into the soil so that fields aren't stripped of their nutrients and resources over time. And also new technologies like new types of plows that dug deeper into the earth. And that could be driven by fewer oxen, right? So fewer sort of draft animals. So all of this meant that agricultural production started to increase during this period too. This is a chart of agricultural production in Britain at the time, and of two main crops, the two main sort of staple crops in Britain, wheat and barley. And you can see, right, that there's a dramatic rise in agricultural production throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. In fact, production in 1800 was more than double the agricultural production in Britain in 1600. So these are some of the factors that start to lead to this population boom. One of the costs of this population boom, however, is that with more people came fewer opportunities for land ownership. Right? So as more of the population survived, there was essentially more trouble for the people who did survive to actually own their own land. So with population boom came a kind of social crisis, or a social land crisis, where fewer and fewer people were able to own their own land and subsist off their own land. Partnering with this and in conjunction with this was the fact that most European countries during this period also began to industrialize. Their economies began to industrialize. So what does that mean? What that means is that uh, essentially most of these countries started to create and started to produce factories that mechanized production, meaning that goods that were produced were not just produced by hand, but produced by machines that were powered by something else, right? Thus increasing the amount of goods that were produced, right, and creating these new economic opportunities, right? Factories were placed in cities where there were large labor supplies, and they actually drew people into cities to get jobs. Um, to sort of show you some evidence of this, this chart that you see right here is a chart of iron production in European countries over time. And iron was one of the main kind of industrial goods that's produced by many European countries at this time. It was a sort of bedrock of the industrial economy. And what you see, right, is that the percentage increase of iron production is off the charts. I mean, it's a huge increase over this time, and that's because iron production started to get mechanized, right? It started to become produced in factories, right, by machines and powered by things like burning coal, right, fossil fuels. So as industrialization happened, a few things were sort of affected. One, more products were available for cheaper, which meant that clothes and all sorts of sort of household goods were much more available to people at this time. That improved sort of the quality of living and also the survival rate of a lot of people, right? But also it changed the economy so that more and more people started to move away from being primarily farmers and started to live in cities where they worked in factories and in the industrial sector. In fact, by 1850, 75% of the adult male population in England worked in industrial production already by 1850. And the interesting thing here is it's not just a story of England. Industrialization was a story of many European countries during this time. And this chart sort of shows, right, that lots of European countries began to industrialize and started to account for more and more of the world's global production. That's what this chart shows, sort of all the goods produced in the world, which countries were accountable for which percentages of that. And you'll see, right, that most of the countries that were involved in global production by the late 19th century are in Europe, right? But there's also one other country that's really important here, and it became the world's biggest producer by about 1880, and that's the United States. So why is this important? It's important because with industrialization came urbanization. What I mean is that when factories started popping up in cities, they drew people to those cities to work in the factories. We see this first in England, right? In England in 1800, only 21% of the English population was urban. By the 1890s, it was over 60%, right? And the population of London rose dramatically during this period from something in the ballpark of like 676,000 in 1750 to 2.3 million by 1850, and 4 million by 1890, and 7 million by 1914. The same story happened in the United States, right? As the US started to industrialize, more and more people started moving to American cities, and the American population started to shift. So you can see in this chart, right, that the United States was primarily rural. It was an agricultural nation for much of its history until the 19th century, when industrialization started to rapidly increase. And then in the 1880s, we see really a dramatic turn, so that just before 1920, the majority of the US population actually lived in urban areas rather than rural areas. So industrialization provided a major pull factor of migrants from rural areas to urban areas, and sometimes from places where there was not a lot of industrialization, right? Countries where there weren't a lot of industrial opportunities to countries where there were, like the United States. But industrialization also provided a means for this migration. So steam engines not only powered factories, but they also powered modes of transport. Railroads are, of course, the ones that you probably think of the most, but you can also think of steamships, right? Steam-powered ships increased the speed at which transatlantic travel could happen. In the 18th century, sail ships took something in the ballpark of like 5 to 6 weeks to travel from England to New York City. In the 19th century, steam-powered ships cut that to 2 weeks. Plus, the more steamships that started to get into operation, the cheaper that mode of travel became, right? So by the 1860s, steam travel between England or between Europe and the United States started to get actually much more affordable than ever before. So all of these things sort of tell us about how industrialization provided this kind of major pull factor of migrants from non-industrial parts of the world to industrial parts of the world. And one of the biggest industrialized parts of the world in the late 19th century was the United States. But there are other factors involved in pushing people too. And one main one was famine. So ironically, despite the fact that agricultural production was increasing in most parts of Europe, there were still places of Europe that experienced massive and devastating famines during this period. The one that we probably know the best is the potato blight, or the Great Famine in Ireland in the 1840s. This had to do with a lot of things, right? It had to do with the dependence of the Irish population, of much of the Irish population, on just one crop, on the potato, and essentially a disease that came and totally killed that crop in the 1840s. But it also had to do with the fact that, or it also had to do with politics. So Ireland at the time was controlled by Britain, right, by the English Parliament. And a lot of people sort of saw the British response to the potato blight as making the situation worse, right? These political cartoons that you see here kind of show evidence of this. Many of the politicians in London looked for sort of long-term solutions rather than short-term aid to help the Irish population. And so the response of many people in Ireland was to look to emigration as the only way that they could survive, right? One quote from an Irish newspaper kind of illustrates this really clearly and sort of dramatically. The newspaper reporter writes, "Disease and death in every quarter. The once hardy population work away to emaciated skeletons. Fever, dropsy, diarrhea, and famine, rioting in every filthy hovel and sweeping away whole families. The population perceptibly lessened, death diminishing the destitution, hundreds frantically rushing from their home and country, not with the idea of making fortunes in other lands, but to fly from a scene of suffering and death." Now, this is really depressing. This is really sad. But it illustrates what was happening in Ireland at the time, right? That many were leaving, not because of pull factors necessarily, but because they felt pushed by the terrible situation that they experienced in Ireland at the time. The one final push factor that I want to highlight here is also political, right, or even more political. And that was the revolutions of 1848. So in the year 1848, we get this wave of revolutions that hit European countries and cities all over the continent. This map shows you, right? You can sort of look at this map and see where the revolutions occurred, and it happens all over Europe. And these revolutions all had certain themes in common. They were all largely sort of democratic revolutions. And what I mean by that is that most European countries at this time were still sort of conservative monarchies, right? And the people that were revolting in 1848 were all pushing for some sort of democratic reforms, some sort of democratic governance in their countries. The reason that the 1848 revolutions sort of play a role in this story of migration is because almost all of these revolutions were failures, right? The revolutions may have succeeded for a certain period of months or weeks, but in the end, the sort of entrenched governments were able to suppress the revolutions and restore order. Why this is significant is because a lot of people participated in these revolutions, and when they failed, they found themselves on the sort of opposing side of this government, right? They found themselves as political dissidents. And so many people in Europe who participated in the revolutions of 1848 looked for a way out, right? They fled their countries and went to other parts of the world, including the United States. They were essentially political exiles in the wake of these revolutions. So, what have we covered, right? In the 19th century, we see lots of crises that sort of push, or lots of transformations that push and pull people to and from, particularly from Europe to the United States, right? Everything from demographic booms that make competition for land much harder, to industrialization, right, that pulls people to places where there are jobs, like American cities, to famine, right, that pushed people from Ireland to places where there was simply food. And fourth, to the 1848 revolutions that created political dissidents and then made those political dissidents sort of enemies of the state. So all of these things feature in the stories of immigration that you're going to read about more this week.